Are you ready to bounce?
My name is Jay Kulagayan, and I am writer and publisher of a comic book called Mest. I started a theater company way back 22 years ago called No Theater of Cincinnati, and they focused on multicultural and just kind of the stories that needed to be told. I started as a director and a playwright, but honestly, my thinking as far as comic books started when I was 9 years old when I was collecting. I've always wanted to write and create my own comics. And what's wonderful is writing such as playwriting and directing plays, it really helps you with that concept of storyboarding. With comic books. So that's been my career so far. I do also fundraising for different nonprofit organizations in the Cincinnati area and write different reviews. And honestly, any opportunity you can to just write and try different things, take those opportunities. Admittedly, some of them might be volunteer opportunities, but some might be paid work as well.
My name is Javier Solorzano. I'm a writer, artist, comic book creator from Los Angeles, California. And I write and draw a lot of comics that deal with like Lucha Libre and cats. I started Lucha Cat as a sort of clothing brand to do those two sort of parts of my life that I sort of tend to always fall back on and mash them up together. And that clothing line kind of morphed into a new comic book series that has consumed me for the better part of the last year called Super Lucha Cats, which is going to be a sort of a comic book series where think of it as like Scooby-Doo and the gang meets El Santo and Blue Demon. And it's going to take place areas around my hometown. I grew up in Bell Gardens, California. That's where they're from. And they'll be meeting and fighting with monsters in places like Downey, East LA, Maywood, and what else? Oh, I also have a comic book called Luchísima, which is more of a straightforward Lucha Libre comic book, which is going to be, it's a little less sci-fi and a little bit more just pulpy 80s people in masks hopping out of cars and fighting bad guys. For the most part.
Hi, I'm Handra Gamboa. Primarily, I'm a high school teacher. I also write comics, and I think that's what brought us here today. My comic is only about a few years old. I got about 5 issues. I wanted to write comics to show people that I never saw in comics before, and I think a lot of creators that are involved in this organization, this program, kind of feel the same way. So yeah, like I never saw anybody that looked like me in a comic unless he was mugging somebody in an alley or some kind, or was like kind of the punchline or like just like, oh, that silly guy with his funny words. So I wanted to make comics that showed like people that look like me, acted like me, because there's something unique to being a minority nerd. we're not really like the comic book guy in The Simpsons. We work on cars. We're good at stuff too. So I just wanted to make something also that my goddaughter could read, because when she was starting to read and I would take her to the comic store, she would point at something because, hey, you like that guy, don't you? I'm like, hell yeah, Green Lantern. Pull it off the shelf, turn the page, a guy's getting his hand cut off. I'm not going to show that to a 7-year-old. So I wanted something that was all ages, that shows people that you don't normally see in a positive light.
Hello, my name is Jay Monk. I'm a comic writer who specializes in YA and middle grade comics.
My name is Stanley Waney. I'm a artist publisher. I started in comics in 1996. Worked for Void Comics. I wrote and drew a comic book called Soul Slayer, which had like a pretty good run. Afterwards, I kind of left the world of comics and came back to it. I have a degree in electrical engineering, actually. So I went to work for a bit, and after that came back in the world of arts in 2006. There I went back to school in art school. Right away, I started getting involved in the publishing side of the business. I started Trip Comics with somebody else for a while. That's when I published Agalma, my first graphic novel, which was nominated for a prize at the Toronto Comics and Arts Festival for Best Experimental Graphic Novel. After that, I published two other graphic novels, Dream Cave the following year, and then Sequences. Actually, both of these books are going to be gathered in one book. They're going to be published by Conundrum Press. We're working on that for next year, so stay tuned for that. My main influences in well, I should say visual arts, because although I really love comics, the comic book artists were not my first influences. My greatest influences on the style that I draw are Gustave Doré, who's a 19th century French artist, and Sergio Topi, who's the Italian illustrator. I basically work with mixed medium type of collage type of thing. I draw in a style that's very reminiscent of collage. I don't like boundaries, so I really mixed everything together. The style of storytelling that I use is non-linear. So to me, putting everything in boxes doesn't quite make sense. So I use China ink. I use a lot of acrylic medium. I like cross-hatching. I think another one of my really big influences is Achiera Kurosawa, the Japanese filmmaker who's extraordinary. I remember seeing his movies from back when I was 8 years old and just being taken with the imagery. I think him and Gustave Doré have this commonality where the gray tones in their work is so profound that it's something that stayed with me up until now. So yeah, that's basically the way I work. And I mostly work by improvising. So I will have these images which act as border instead of having squares in a page. I will just use an image as a border. And then from there, I just improvise in between these main images. I just improvise in between. And this type of story I tell is really an improvisation, right? It comes from the left side of the brain. It's a very feminine way to tell a story. So that's why most of my heroes are always females, always like women. Yeah.
When it comes to comic books, when I was 9, it was, people say that comics are an escape, and I would agree with that sometimes that was the way. And again, we're talking about 40 some years ago, and there was no internet. There was no internet. There's no Google. There's no Wikipedia. So the way you found out about stuff to me was either outlaw things were music, and outlaw things were comic books, and that's how you were able to explore different worlds. And it's not just about escapism, but to me it was also characters dealing with problems and doing solutions to that. And in my mind, okay, well, those are different possibilities on how I could deal with different problems. And comics at that time were dealing with things like racism. They were dealing with things like teen problems, alcoholism. It was just thinly veiled under the guise of fighting a villain.
I love having an idea and seeing it transform before my eyes. Let's see, I also just like pictures with words a lot. I'm a hyperactive person, so I have a hard time reading myself when it comes to prose. But like comics keep me engaged, and I feel it might be the same for a lot of kids out there. I'm interested in cartoons because I've been interested in cartoons since I was a kid. I've loved cartoons, and I would love to get into that medium and be able to express myself in that sort of way as well.
I really love comics, but in a lot of ways, I find comics kind of restrictive, and not only what they do, but how they do it. So in comics, you have so the medium of comics is considered as a language, as a way of saying things. And I find sometimes that could be kind of limiting because it could be so much more. I find the medium could be so much more. That's why I really like comic book creators that come from the visual arts or design, because I think they bring so much more to the medium, not only as a way graphically, but just a way to tell the stories, and like I say, Achiera Kurosawa is one of my biggest influence in the way I tell a story, because to me, the question is, where does a story begin, right? That's so in movies, in comic books, you go from A to B, and then you have this protagonist or this antagonist that moves the action along, but does the story really begin there? What brought the conditions for your protagonist to be at this place at this time? That's the interesting part for me. There was this old cop show from the 50s. I remember. Something City. I don't remember the title. And basically, this girl got kidnapped. Her dad was rich, and then the police went and got the girl, and they saved her, and they brought her back to the dad, and they said, "Oh, okay, this story ends well because you got your little girl back." And to me, I'm like, no, it's not. That's not the end of the story. That's the beginning of the story. Because when you think about it, what are the implications of that girl being kidnapped? What are the implications of her spending a night with a bunch of thieves, and you don't know what happened, right? And what are the implications of what comes next in her life? To me, that's much more interesting than the whole action adventure side of it. So to me, that's why I make comics a bit differently than the mainstream, because these questions are never really, well, they are in some ways. I think if you look at a character like Batman, they'll take their time to go that way, but in general, it's not really something that's advocated in comic books. And me, that's my interest. So yeah.
I kind of always gravitated towards drawing, painting, and even at a young age, I knew that what I wanted to do when I grew up was telling stories somehow. For a long time, that was, I want to write books. And then that became, well, I want to do movies, I want to do cartoons. And when I got out of college, I realized all of those things sort of require you to work with groups of other people. And I can be a bit of a loner a lot of times. And I fell back to a lot of the stuff I did when I was a kid, which was draw comic books. When I was 5, 6, my dad he still works at a commissary for a restaurant chain. And he'd bring home these giant sheets of pink and orange butcher paper. And he'd bring me the Sharpies that the carniceros would, write on the paper carne molida, whatever. And he told me here, draw with this, do whatever you want with this. And a lot of those early drawings were stories about me and my dog at the time. So I kind of always dealt with narratives around my pets and around those characters then merging with the stuff I was watching on TV, which was, Spider-Man, Batman, and then Lucha Libre, which was a huge turning point for me because luchadores to me are they're real life superheroes, right? They wear the mask. They have an entire secret identity. They literally fight bad guys in front of us, and a lot of times for us, because those bad guys are disrespecting us. They're talking bad about our hometown. And to see that live and be able to like have them wave at you as a child, it just blew my mind wide open. And so growing up, I was always drawing, luchadores in space, luchadores riding dinosaurs, just taking the stuff I would see like Santo and Mil Máscaras and those guys in those movies I would watch, and just blowing it out with like stuff I was watching on TV, like Transformers and Godzilla. And as I got older, hi Coco, that was my cat. A lot of those influences also started getting seasoned with other stuff I saw growing up. So if it was lowrider magazines with my cousin, if it was athletes I looked up to like Magic Johnson, and taking the ideas of like the team color jerseys and making superhero costumes out of those things, that sort of amalgamation of everything I was consuming kind of always kept pushing me forward. And now that I'm older, I felt the need to sort of, I want to put out a comic. And so I did. I started falling back on the things that were there when I was a kid, which was my pets, lucha libre, and my cultura. One of my mentors told me very early on, a lot of narrative ideas have been done already, but nobody has told your story. You have a story inside of you. That's what makes it unique. And so for me, that is things like lucha libre. It's my cats, Coco and pizza. It's eating tacos with your friends in the middle of the night. And a lot of my comic books sort of deal with those things. She's very vocal. She wants to be in this interview. And that's always just been my like guiding light with a lot of the stuff I do.
Being a literature teacher and my dad being a literature and history professor, a lot of my influences aren't just comics. I remember my dad once said, if you want to do something artistic, you can't just look at that art. Like sculptors shouldn't just look at sculptures. Writers shouldn't just read. You get out there, get your hands dirty, do something. So a lot of what I write, actually, the inspirations come from epic poetry. Don Quixote is like one of my favorite stories. It was it's tattooed right there. And also Aztec mythology was like, that's that tattoo. Those influence a lot of what I write. Like right now I'm reading the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's I think technically the oldest written story, that we can find, that as far as humans go, at least. I know there's ancient alien theorists. I'll leave them to it. But and I'm reading it and I'm like, this is a very tolerant book. I don't know how else to word it. Like, they're talking about men loving men, and it's not a big deal. They're not being punished for it. They're not turning into salt or whatever. They're just like, it was just a matter of course. And that could just mean like bro, or like, we fought together, we die together, like Fast and the Furious kind of silliness. But I don't see it that way. I'm reading this thinking this is 3,000 years old, and they're like 3,000 years ahead of how half this country thinks. And I see the story I'm writing right now, which we'll probably go into more later, as more of an epic poem than a comic. I see it as like, the typical hero's journey. I use a lot of what I learned and a lot of what I teach to write the story. I don't really advertise to my students that I write these comics. Now and then a kid will see me like at a local show, because I have an unusual last name. There's a comic book store in town, and they say, are you related to a guy that writes a comic? And I was like, oh, that's me, because I don't lie to the kids either. But I also don't want to make a big deal out of it. And I got and they read it and they say, like, I've never seen a Mexican superhero. I'm like, there's a reason, because there aren't a lot. Hopefully that's changing, but so yeah. And what was I talking about? Yeah. So as far as the epic poetry goes, that's kind of like probably my biggest influence for anything I've ever written. I used to write short stories. I paid for college writing short stories, and those were fun little things. But I wanted to write something bigger, something in larger scope, and nothing like an epic poem to show like a guy from like, because with an epic poem you see the rise and the fall.
I write and produce a comic book called Mest, and Mest is the nickname for the Metropolitan Sewer District, and it features a character named Lilliput, and she is kind of our tour guide to the weird, wet, wild world beneath our feet. I would say that people have described this comic book as kind of a Tank Girl meets Tremors meets Hellboy kind of comic. What's great about it is inspired by my daughters. I created this book, so there's no swear words. I create my own swear words, so it's very family friendly. But honestly, a regular note for the artist Dylan Speak, who I work with on all the illustrations. A regular note is please more disgusting, please more gross. So that occurs on a regular basis. So if you're not into sewers and disgusting, this book's not for you. One of the things that we want to do is just try and get the story out there. So if you go to our website at Messed, MESSED, comics.com, they are free digitally. They're also free on Webtoons. Webtoons, we just got on there, so we're getting the whole season there for free. We've collected into a trade with 2 bonus stories, and you can purchase that on our website, or you can find us at Comic-Cons when Comic-Cons come back. So we're really looking forward to sharing the story with you. We love the feedback and the excitement everybody has when they find us after buying it. They come and find us again, or they read about us and they come find us. I mean, we love talking to people, and we want to share this story with as many people as we can.
There's Topside, which is a book that I was released just last year, 2019. It's about a girl who's forced to go to the surface of the planet for the first time after she made a huge mistake. And there's my ongoing comic, Starhammer, which is about a teen who inherits an alien hammer and makes a series of increasingly poor mistakes. And yeah, those are both pretty much the only things I've written, but they're pretty important to my career. Another part of my career that I'm really proud of is Enough Space for Everyone Else, which is an anthology I published in 2017. It is a collection of sci-fi and fantasy stories about space, but doesn't include imperialism or war of any kind. It's just about everything else you can do in space, which is everything else. So.
I would probably recommend a book that came out about 2 years ago called Tales from La Vida. I have a 2-page story in it. Daryl Watson, I think. Okay, yeah, Daryl Watson. He drew the art. That's a good introduction to me because that's a story of me as a teacher. It was something that it's idealized. I'm a little skinnier, a little younger, a little less gray, but it's me. And I remember the kids asking me after the Oscars once, they said something like, don't you wish there were more Oscar winners or actors that were Mexican? I'm like, no, I want more Mexicans in college and as doctors. I want them to, policy makers. You can have Hollywood. I'll watch your movies. I don't care. But that's not as important to me as, community leaders and, people that call the shots. I want more brown people there. I want more anything there. I don't want to just look up and see people that look like the guys on The Money.
So as a parent, I have 2 daughters, and I had the opportunity, the privilege to introduce them to the things I love. But then in turn, what I didn't realize is they reintroduce those things you love back to you. And so your favorite science fiction movie or your favorite novel, your very fantasy series, you realize that it might not be as gender equitable, or it might be homogenized in race, and just certain problems, how they treat certain characters. And so I started to explore more things that I loved. And so, for example, the Studio Ghibli films, Miyazaki films like Spirited Away or Castle in the Sky, those are things that I felt better showing my daughters because it's a little bit more equitable. It's a little bit more diverse, which I really like. And that's actually what inspired me to create this comic book, to create Mest. Lilliput is the lead character, and she happens to be, she is a strong character that happens to be female, happens to be Asian, And one of the things I really wanted to accomplish is really small, in that when I bring my daughters with me to a comic book store or a bookstore, they get to see someone who looks like them on the shelves. And to me, that's honestly, that was one of my main things I wanted to accomplish. So I could say that's, I can cross that off the list.
It's been really great seeing artists I follow who before were not very politically active in their work become a little bit radicalized by what they're seeing happening, and creating content that speaks to those issues now. And then on top of that, seeing younger people consume that and engage with it. And I'm not sure we would have had that if we had a pandemic. And people much smarter than me can probably talk to you about whether or not that's a good or a bad thing. But in light of our circumstance, it's been one of like the highlights, is seeing my friends go and log into Zoom meetings with like city council to find out what the budget being proposed is gonna like give money towards, right? Are we gonna choose to fund local outreach for kids and address homelessness and deal with drug addiction in our community? Or are we just gonna keep flowing money to the same places as it always has been and not really addressing the issues? And I mean, even me, I wasn't always the most active in that sense with my art, because I never really felt I had a good, like I always felt there's people who can say this much better than I can. But now I'm realizing, no, you just need to say it. You need to say it even if you're parroting what somebody you really resonate with and admire said. Amplify that. If that's what you can do, amplify that. If you have a following of 100 people on Instagram, turn around and provide that 100-person, space to like a Black voice, to a queer voice, to a minority voice, and let that filter out to people who might not have heard it. And that part has been the most, I'm not going to say rewarding, because I don't want to breed complacency in it, because we can't stop doing it, but it's been really nice seeing that, because it's been rough the last 3.5 years for a lot of people. There's people living in your communities who are unsure if they want to go outside before the pandemic because they don't want to get deported, even though they're providing essential services in your neighborhood. And now those people at least know that somebody in their neighborhood cares about them and is speaking out for them. And we might not have had that before. Do I wish we could go out and hug each other and give my friends a kiss on the cheek and hold them tight? Of course I do. But I think we need to come to grips with the fact that we're going to have to respect social distance for a while. We're going to have to wear our masks and now focus on what we're doing online, because people are at home now. They're on their phones longer. What are they consuming? Are we going to let them read about minority issues, or are we going to turn around and let them read stuff like Pizzagate and QAnon? Like, it's a very real thing now. But that wave of like, we're gonna push back on this and we're gonna wear our masks at a protest has been very encouraging.
And of course, an artist you can't escape your surrounding, your realities. An artist is influenced heavily by the reality in which he or she lives in. So like the whole like social movement that we're in now, I think I've always had like this thing where I would like be polite about talking out about like social issues and so on. I think now I'm a bit more direct talking about it. So that kind of changed a bit like the way I work. But I mean, again, we go back to like the accident, the need to show how culture is something that brings us together than more than takes us apart. I think that's where my work is at now, and that's where I think it'll continue to be, for a while. So I think it's